They told you privacy was for your protection. They told you it was about safety, about security, about stopping criminals and keeping the digital world clean. But what if the real reason they fear your privacy is because it threatens their corruption? What if the most dangerous thing to powerful people today is not weapons, not protests, not even elections, but your ability to exist unseen? For decades, corruption survived in locked rooms, offshore accounts, fake companies, and whispered deals. Today, it survives inside servers, data centers, algorithms, and invisible digital records. Every click you make, every message you send, every purchase you complete is tracked, stored, analyzed, and somewhere behind that wall of data, powerful systems are watching, not just criminals, not just terrorists, but everyone, including you. Because the truth is, the more visible you are, the safer corruption becomes. And the moment citizens regain privacy, corruption starts to panic. This is not a story about hackers or conspiracy theories. This is the story of how power learned to hide inside data, how corruption adapted to the digital age, how governments and corporations quietly built the largest surveillance machine in human history, and why the simple act of protecting your privacy has now become a political threat, a financial threat, and a direct threat to the systems that steal from you every day. By the end of this investigation, you will understand why the same institutions that speak endlessly about transparency work tirelessly to make sure you never disappear from their sight. We live in an age where everything is connected. Phones, cars, homes, bank accounts, cameras, watches, even voices inside our living rooms. And we are told this is progress. We are told this is convenience. We are told this is freedom. But history teaches us something different. Every time technology evolves, power races ahead of the people to control it. And in the digital age, control is no longer about armies in the streets. It is about data in the shadows. Corruption used to leave footprints. Bribes had to be carried, paper trails had to be erased, witnesses had to be silenced. But now, corruption moves at the speed of light. Money jumps across borders in milliseconds. Influence spreads through invisible networks. Decisions affecting millions are shaped by data few will ever see. And surveillance is the glue holding this entire system together. Because corruption hates uncertainty. It hates blind spots. It hates citizens who cannot be tracked, predicted, profiled, or pressured. When people vanish from the data stream, power loses its map. When transactions become untraceable, bribes become risky. When communication becomes private, leaks become possible. And when leaks become possible, empires begin to crack. This is why governments say they want to protect you, while building systems that monitor you. This is why corporations speak about user trust, while harvesting behavior at industrial scale. This is why laws expand quietly. Databases grow silently, and surveillance becomes normal before anyone fully understands what was surrendered. The language is always gentle. National security, public safety, fraud prevention. But behind those words lies a deeper truth. Visibility protects power, and privacy threatens it. For ordinary people, surveillance feels distant, abstract, technical. It feels like something designed for criminals, not for workers, students, families, or retirees. But corruption does not steal only from bank vaults. It steals from public budgets, from national debt, from healthcare systems, from education funds, from disaster relief, from pensions, from taxes paid by people who will never see where their money truly goes. And the quieter the system becomes, the safer that theft continues. Your privacy is not just about hiding personal secrets. It is about protecting the space where corruption cannot easily operate. It is about preserving zones where power cannot instantly silence, target, freeze, or erase. It is about delaying the invisible hand long enough for truth to surface. Because once every move is tracked, every dollar monitored, every conversation archived, corruption no longer needs to fear exposure. It only needs to manage the data. The tragedy is that most people were never asked if they consented to this world. It was built slowly. A camera here, a database there. A law passed quietly after a crisis. A new platform introduced for convenience. A new policy hidden inside a software update. And before anyone could step back and see the whole picture, the infrastructure was already in place. Permanent visibility became the default condition of modern life. And yet, despite all this power, corruption still feels nervous. Because history has shown, again and again, that the most dangerous force to any empire is not violence. It is exposure, not revolution, but revelation, not chaos, but truth. And truth cannot survive inside systems where everything is controlled, unless there is a place left for people to speak, move, transact, and resist beyond total observation. This documentary is about that battlefield, the one you cannot see, the war between privacy and corruption, between visibility and power, between ordinary citizens and the digital structures that quietly decide who is watched, who is flagged, who is silenced, and who is protected. We will follow how corruption escaped the old world and redesigned itself inside the new one. We will uncover how data became the most valuable currency on Earth, how surveillance stopped being an emergency measure and became permanent architecture, how power learned to predict behavior before people even realized they were being shaped, and finally, we will reveal why the simple idea of privacy now terrifies systems built on theft, secrecy, and control. Because in the end, this is not just about technology, it is about who gets to see and who gets to disappear. It is about who controls the map of society and who is trapped inside it. And once you truly understand why your privacy is a threat to corruption, you will never see the digital world the same way again. They sold us the internet as freedom, a world without borders, without gatekeepers, without limitations. A place where information moved faster than power, where voices could rise without permission, where anyone could be seen and heard. And for a moment it felt true. The screens lit up, the connections multiplied, the world got smaller. But something else was being built at the same time, quietly, invisibly, and far more permanently. Every convenience came with a cost we were never asked to calculate. Every search, every message, every tap of the screen, trails began to form. Patterns took shape. Profiles became sharper. At first it felt harmless. After all, what danger could there be in recommending a video, a product, a song? But recommendations turned into predictions. Predictions turned into influence. And influence turned into control. We were told that data was neutral, that algorithms were objective, that machines had no bias. But power has always loved machines because machines never ask why, they only execute. Behind every automated system there is still a human agenda, and behind every massive data operation there is still a question of who benefits. The illusion of digital freedom works because it feels voluntary. You choose to post, you choose to share, you choose to click agree. But choice loses its meaning when refusal means exclusion. No account means no access. No data means no service. No visibility means no participation. Freedom slowly becomes conditional. What makes this illusion so powerful is that it does not feel like a prison. It feels like a playground, bright, fast, addictive, always available. And while people laugh, scroll, shop, and connect, something essential is being normalized, the idea that constant observation is simply the price of existing in modern society. In the past, surveillance required manpower, files, cameras, and physical presence. It was expensive, it was visible, it was limited. Today, surveillance is automatic, endless, and silent. It does not sleep, it does not forget, it does not forgive. And most importantly, it does not need your awareness to function. This is where corruption learned its first great lesson of the digital age. The best control system is the one people willingly feed. No raids, no interrogations, no checkpoints, just participation. And once visibility becomes permanent, corruption no longer needs to hide in shadows. It simply learns to hide inside systems, inside complexity. Inside layers so deep that ordinary people cannot see where the theft begins or where the accountability ends. Freedom did not disappear overnight. It was diluted, distracted, entertained into silence. The illusion survived because it never felt like force. And that is exactly why it worked. Corruption did not vanish in the digital age. It upgraded. In the old world, corruption needed physical space, cash-filled envelopes, paper contracts, warehouses of records, rooms where deals could be whispered behind closed doors. Exposure depended on documents, witnesses, and human error. But when the world moved online, corruption found something far more powerful than secrecy. It found scale. Money no longer had to cross borders in suitcases. It moved as numbers in silent streams. Influence no longer required personal meetings. It traveled through networks, algorithms, and engineered narratives. Power no longer needed to intimidate openly. It learned to reshape behavior quietly. Shell companies became digital ghosts. Offshore accounts multiplied in systems designed to confuse rather than clarify. Transactions scattered across thousands of micro-movements that no single human could follow. What once required coordination now required only code. And every layer of complexity acted like camouflage. This transformation didn't make corruption louder. It made it quieter and safer. Because the digital world does something powerful for corruption. It fragments responsibility. When everything is automated, no one person appears to be in control. When decisions are made by software, accountability dissolves into technical language. Glitches replace guilt, errors replace intent, and abuse hides behind complexity. This is how theft becomes procedural, how exploitation becomes policy, how enrichment becomes optimization. The most dangerous form of corruption today does not rely on illegal actions alone. It lives inside legal frameworks carefully engineered to serve a narrow elite. Tax codes that punish labor and reward speculation. Financial loopholes that drain public wealth into private empires. Regulatory systems that protect institutions rather than people. And the public rarely sees it happening because the crime no longer looks like crime. It looks like finance. It looks like compliance. It looks like systems doing what systems are designed to do. The digital world turned corruption into infrastructure. It also erased distance. A corrupt decision in one office can ripple across continents in seconds. A manipulated dataset can shape markets, elections, public opinion, and economic futures all at once. The scale is no longer measured in millions. It is measured in societies. And yet, for the average citizen, corruption still feels abstract, invisible, distant, something discussed in headlines, not felt in daily life. But the effects are always personal. Underfunded hospitals, crumbling schools, rising debt, stagnant wages, disappearing pensions. These are not accidents, these are downstream consequences. Corruption in the digital age doesn't need to announce itself. It only needs to remain unchallenged long enough to become normal. And the longer it stays embedded inside systems, the harder it becomes to distinguish where governance ends and where exploitation begins. They call money the most powerful force on earth. But money has been quietly replaced. Today, the most valuable resource in human history is not gold, not oil, not currency. It is data, invisible, weightless, endlessly reproducible, and more revealing than any confession. Every heartbeat tracked by a smartwatch, every location logged by a phone, every hesitation of a mouse, every pause of a scroll, every late-night search, every private doubt typed into a glowing screen. These fragments don't look powerful on their own. But when collected at scale, they become something unprecedented, a living behavioral map of entire populations. Data does not just show what people did. It predicts what they will do, what they will buy, who they will trust, what they will fear, who they will vote for, when they are vulnerable, when they are angry, when they are ready to be influenced. That is why data is worth more than money. Money only shows what was spent. Data reveals who you are before you even act. Power learned quickly what this meant. Instead of controlling resources alone, it could now shape behavior directly, not through force, not through censorship, but through precision. Through nudges so subtle they feel like free will, through feeds tailored to emotion, through content designed not to inform but to steer. This is how influence became industrialized, and corruption followed immediately behind it. Because when behavior can be predicted, markets can be manipulated. When emotions can be triggered on command, public opinion can be engineered. When attention can be controlled, accountability can be delayed, drowned, or redirected. The theft no longer happens only through stolen money, it happens through stolen choices. People believe they choose freely. But the environment around them is curated. What they see, what they don't see, what trends, what disappears, what becomes scandal, what becomes noise. Algorithms do not just reflect society, they quietly shape it. And the more this system grows, the more asymmetrical power becomes. On one side, billions of people reduced to data sets, predictable, measurable, monetized. On the other side, a small concentration of institutions that can see patterns nobody else can see. They know how populations move before the populations know themselves. This knowledge is priceless, and like all priceless things, it attracts corruption. Because with enough data, laws can be bypassed without breaking them, markets can be tilted without obvious fraud, perception can be altered without visible censorship, and control can be exercised without appearing to rule. The most dangerous part is not that data is powerful. It is that people were never meant to be this transparent to authority, while authority remains so opaque to them. And in that imbalance, corruption does not hide behind walls anymore. It hides behind math. There was a time when government surveillance and corporate data collection were separate worlds. One wore a badge, the other wore a logo. One spoke the language of national security, the other spoke the language of profit. But over time, those two worlds quietly merged, and almost no one was invited to watch it happen. Governments realized they could no longer build surveillance at the speed technology evolved. Corporations realized they were sitting on oceans of behavioral intelligence no intelligence agency could ever collect alone. And so, a marriage formed, quiet, contractual, and incredibly powerful. Public safety became the public explanation. Terror threats, cybercrime, fraud, extremism, each crisis carved out a new exception. Each exception expanded access, and every expansion became permanent. Data that people thought belonged to apps began flowing into state systems. Location histories, contact networks, purchase behavior, financial movements, biometric identifiers, even patterns of speech, mood, and intent. What citizens saw as convenience slowly became a pipeline. This is where the illusion of choice hardened into architecture. Corporations built the interfaces, governments wrote the mandates, and between them grew an ecosystem where visibility is treated not as a temporary measure, but as infrastructure. The most unsettling part is how clean it all looks on paper. Memorandums, agreements, compliance standards, national regulations, international frameworks. Everything appears orderly, legal, responsible. But legality does not equal justice, and compliance does not equal consent. Because consent requires understanding, and most people have never been told how much of their lives is being observed, shared, and analyzed in real time. This alliance feeds on asymmetry. Citizens must be transparent by default. Power remains selectively visible. Oversight committees operate in secrecy. Surveillance programs are classified. Algorithms are protected as trade secrets. And the public is asked to trust systems they are not allowed to inspect. That is not accountability. That is concentration. And wherever concentration grows unchecked, corruption follows like a shadow. Because when governments depend on corporate data, corporations gain political leverage. When corporations enforce state surveillance, governments gain deniability. And when both share the same data streams, both share the same interests. The line between public governance and private control begins to blur. Who owns the data? Who decides how long it is stored? Who determines when it is used as evidence or influence or pressure? These questions rarely reach open debate, because by the time the public learns about a system, it is already too embedded to easily dismantle. The danger is not only that you are being watched. The danger is that the watchers answer to multiple masters. And corruption thrives best in places where responsibility is shared, and guilt is impossible to assign. Privacy used to be treated as a personal preference, something individual, optional, almost cosmetic. But inside systems built on surveillance and data extraction, privacy becomes something else entirely. It becomes a threat. Because corruption depends on visibility in only one direction. It thrives when citizens can be watched, tracked, predicted, and pressured, while power itself remains shielded behind legal walls, classified systems, and corporate opacity. The moment that balance shifts, corruption feels exposed, nervous, vulnerable. Privacy breaks that balance. When communication becomes encrypted, deals become harder to coordinate in the dark. When identities can disappear, retaliation becomes riskier. When money moves without perfect traceability, bribery can no longer hide safely inside approved channels. When people cannot be instantly mapped, flagged, or frozen, leaking becomes possible again. Corruption does not fear justice first. It fears uncertainty. Uncertainty creates hesitation. Hesitation creates mistakes, and mistakes create evidence. This is why every major exposure in modern history begins with a violation of surveillance expectations, an encrypted message that wasn't intercepted, an anonymous transaction that couldn't be reversed, a hidden server copy that escaped erasure, a source who could not be located in time. Privacy does not guarantee truth, but it creates space for truth to survive long enough to surface. And power understands this very well. That is why privacy is constantly rebranded as suspicious, dangerous, criminal adjacent. The language shifts carefully. Only wrongdoers need to hide. Only extremists demand anonymity. Only criminals resist monitoring. Fear becomes the tool that convinces innocent people to surrender the only shield that could one day protect them. But surveillance is not a neutral observer. It is a choke point. Whoever controls it controls timing, access, and consequence. They decide which transactions are flagged and which pass quietly, which communications are labeled threats and which are ignored, which leaks are hunted instantly and which are allowed to vanish into silence. Privacy removes that control. It prevents power from deciding in advance who deserves scrutiny and who deserves immunity. And that is intolerable for corruption. Because corruption does not survive in unpredictable space. It needs controlled environments, managed visibility, selective blindness. It needs to know that the system will see what it is allowed to see and ignore what it must ignore. Privacy does the opposite. It returns uncertainty back to power. And for systems built on stealing without consequence, uncertainty is the beginning of collapse. Once privacy was labeled a threat, the push to contain it accelerated, not with sudden force, but with steady, justified expansion. New laws, new powers, new databases, always following a crisis, always framed as temporary, always becoming permanent. Surveillance no longer needed to argue for existence, it only needed new reasons to grow. Financial systems were the first to tighten. Identity verification became mandatory almost everywhere, every account tied to government documents. Every transaction linked to a profile, every movement through the economy now leaves a footprint that can be reconstructed at will. The language used was safety, anti-money laundering, counterterrorism, fraud prevention, and each layer of monitoring locked citizens deeper into traceability. Then came the expansion into behavior. Social platforms became compliance partners. Location tracking became default. Facial recognition moved from experimental to routine. Predictive policing systems began labeling risk before crime existed. Travel histories, social graphs, purchasing habits, nothing remained isolated anymore. Everything became a node in a single, expanding observational web. What was once targeted became generalized. What was once exceptional became continuous. And what was once controversial quietly became normal. The most dangerous part of this shift was not the technology. It was the psychology. People were taught that surveillance only threatens the guilty, that obedience equals safety, that resistance signals danger, and slowly, the burden of proof reversed. Instead of the state justifying why it watches, the citizen must justify why they want privacy. But surveillance is not just about watching behavior. It reshapes behavior. When people believe they are always seen, they self-censor, they hesitate. They narrow their thoughts to what feels safe. And in that silence, corruption becomes easier to manage because fewer people are willing to cross the invisible lines of consequence. The promise is always protection, yet protection rarely flows upward toward those with power. It flows downward toward those with the least ability to resist. The poor are monitored more closely. The weak are flagged more easily. The marginalized face surveillance as daily pressure, not abstract policy. And corruption continues its work quietly above them, untouched by the dragnet below. Because mass surveillance does not aim equally. It aims predictably. at those without influence, at those without insulation, at those without legal armor. And every new law that expands observation quietly narrows the remaining space where truth can hide. Systems of control do not survive on technology alone. They survive on acceptance. And acceptance is rarely enforced with fear at first. It is trained through comfort. People are not dragged into surveillance. They are eased into it. Convenience becomes the invitation. Faster access, smoother payments, personalized content, seamless services. The friction of daily life is reduced, and in exchange, visibility becomes the price. Over time, constant observation no longer feels like intrusion. It feels like the background noise of modern life. And once surveillance feels normal, resistance begins to feel strange. The mind adapts quickly to what it cannot escape. When cameras are everywhere, being seen feels ordinary. When data is always collected, being tracked feels inevitable. When verification is constant, anonymity feels suspicious. Slowly, without force, obedience becomes reflex. Fear still plays a role, but it is carefully dosed. Just enough headlines, just enough threats. Just enough warnings to keep anxiety alive without pushing people into open rebellion. Danger is always present, but never fully defined. When fear is vague, people surrender more than when it is specific. And corruption benefits from this psychological balance. Because the more predictable behavior becomes, the easier it is to manage, the easier it is to forecast reactions, the easier it is to suppress disruption before it spreads. People begin to police themselves without realizing it. They filter their own words. They reshape their own opinions. They hesitate to ask the wrong questions in the wrong spaces. Surveillance does not just watch the body. It trains the mind. People stop thinking in terms of rights and start thinking in terms of risks. Not should this be monitored, but what happens if I'm flagged? Not is this just, but is this safe for me to say? And in that quiet shift, corruption gains its most reliable defense, the silence of the cautious. The most powerful illusion is the belief that someone else will speak up, that someone else will expose, that someone else will take the risk. Meanwhile, everyone adjusts just enough to survive inside the system without confronting it. This is how mass compliance is born, not through loyalty, but through calculation. And when people begin to think primarily about consequences instead of principles, corruption no longer needs to hide aggressively. It only needs to wait. Because a population trained to second-guess itself will always hesitate longer than power ever will. Every system built for total visibility eventually creates its opposite. In the shadows of mass surveillance, another world begins to take shape. Quiet, fragile, relentless, not driven by chaos, but by refusal. This is where the underground of the digital age is born. Not criminals in the way power defines them, but journalists who refuse to disappear, technologists who refuse to comply quietly, whistleblowers who choose truth over safety, ordinary citizens who reach the moment where silence becomes heavier than risk. They do not gather in public squares. They do not raise flags. They do not announce movements. Their resistance is quieter than that. It lives inside code, inside encrypted channels, inside decentralized networks that refuse to hand control to any single authority. These are not tools of destruction. They are tools of absence. The absence of traceability. The absence of permission. The absence of a central switch that can be turned off. And that absence terrifies power. Because corruption depends on predictable flow, predictable access, predictable pressure. The underground breaks that predictability. It introduces blind spots, delays, unknowns. And for systems addicted to total awareness, unknowns feel like danger. But resistance does not look heroic most of the time. It is lonely, isolated, traumatically expensive. People lose careers, freedom, families. Their names are dragged through campaigns designed to destroy credibility before the truth even arrives. Some vanish into exile, some into prison, some into silence, and others do not make it out at all. History will never record how many stories were killed before they reached daylight, how many warnings died in encrypted drafts, how many truths were buried inside drives that no one could unlock in time. This is the cost of challenging a system that sees itself as the keeper of order. Yet despite the fear, despite the consequences, the underground keeps forming. Because corruption is vast, but it is not indivisible. It fractures under pressure, it leaks, it contradicts itself, and somewhere inside those fractures, people still find cracks wide enough for truth to slip through. Privacy becomes the oxygen of that resistance. Not as an escape from responsibility, but as protection against extinction. Without privacy, resistance cannot gather, it cannot plan, it cannot survive long enough to confront anything larger than itself. Without privacy, truth becomes a spark instantly smothered before it can become fire. The underground exists not because people want to defy power. It exists because power has made defiance the only remaining space where honesty can breathe. Once you step back far enough, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. It repeats across countries, across crises, across decades. First comes fear. Then comes protection, then comes permission, and finally permanence. A threat is announced, the public panics, emergency powers are introduced, surveillance expands, data is centralized, oversight is softened, And when the fear fades, the systems remain. What was once unthinkable becomes routine. What was once temporary becomes infrastructure. This is not accidental. Corruption does not grow randomly. It grows through predictable windows of opportunity, moments when speed replaces debate, when emotion replaces skepticism, when safety replaces liberty as the highest public value. Every expansion of surveillance follows the same architecture. First, it targets them, criminals, terrorists, extremists, outsiders. The risk feels distant, then it quietly shifts to everyone. Because systems built for selective monitoring always hunger for completeness. Gaps are vulnerabilities, blind spots are unacceptable, total visibility becomes the unstated goal. And each time people are told the same thing: if you aren't doing anything wrong, you have nothing to fear. History has proven how dangerous that sentence truly is. Because corruption never defines wrongdoing the same way justice does. It defines it according to threat, not to society, but to power. Today, the threat is not violence alone. It is exposure, it is leaks, it is anonymous coordination, it is movements that cannot be mapped in advance. It is money that moves outside approved channels. It is voices that rise without identifiable leaders. And the response is always the same: more tracking, more verification, more monitoring, more data. The pattern reveals its final truth here. Corruption does not seek order. It seeks predictability. It does not fear chaos as much as it fears the unknown, because unpredictability is the one condition it cannot fully control. Privacy is unpredictable. It breaks behavioral forecasting. It interrupts pressure cycles. It denies instant retaliation. It removes preemptive silencing. It forces power to react instead of anticipate. That is why privacy is framed as a danger. Not because it harms society, but because it destabilizes systems that rely on pre-calculated obedience. Once you see the pattern, it cannot be unseen. The same justifications, the same expansions, the same promises, the same silence afterward. And always beneath it all, the same outcome: more visibility for the public and more insulation for the powerful. Recognizing the pattern is not about technology anymore. It is about understanding how control evolves, and who it always evolves to protect. Here is the truth. Everything has been circling around. Corruption does not fear criminals the way it fears ordinary citizens with privacy. Criminals can be tracked, profiled, infiltrated, flipped. Entire industries exist to manage them. But citizens who can move without being mapped, who can speak without being logged, who can organize without being detected, that is what power cannot fully control. Surveillance was never built primarily to stop crime. Crime is the justification. Surveillance was built to eliminate uncertainty, because uncertainty is the enemy of corruption. Corruption survives by anticipating resistance before it forms. It survives by isolating leaders before movements grow. It survives by freezing accounts before pressure builds. It survives by discrediting voices before they are heard. All of this requires visibility in advance, not reaction, prediction. This is why privacy terrifies the system. Privacy creates time. Privacy creates delay. Privacy creates blind spots. And blind spots are where corruption loses its grip. When everything is visible, corruption does not need to fear exposure. It only needs to manage perception. It can decide which stories spread and which collapse, which scandals explode and which dissolve into noise, which enemies rise and which quietly disappear from relevance. But the moment visibility breaks, the moment a network forms outside the map, the moment money moves where the system cannot instantly reach, the moment coordination happens beyond predictive reach, corruption becomes vulnerable again. This is why the war on privacy never truly pauses. Not after terrorist attacks. Not after financial crashes. Not after pandemics. Not after data breaches. Every crisis only accelerates the same direction: more monitoring, less anonymity, tighter traceability, deeper centralization. The crisis always fades, the control never retreats. And now the final truth becomes clear. The greatest threat to corruption in the digital age is not outrage. It is invisibility. Not protest in the streets, but movement beyond the grid. Not public speeches, but private coordination. Not exposed leaders, but leaderless networks. Not traceable dissent, but untraceable truth. This is why privacy is no longer treated as a right. It is treated as a vulnerability in the system, a hole in the architecture of predictability, a flaw in the infrastructure of control. Power does not ask whether privacy helps citizens, it asks whether privacy interferes with management. And anything that interferes with management becomes a threat, no matter how just it once was. So when you are told that privacy must be reduced for your safety, understand what is really being said. Safety for whom? Because the same systems that claim to protect you from criminals also protect corruption from uncertainty. They ensure that resistance is visible before it is dangerous, that leaks are hunted before they are public, that pressure is neutralized before it is organized. In this world, corruption no longer hides from the system. It hides inside it. And privacy is the one force it cannot fully assimilate without destroying the very illusion of freedom it still depends on. What we are living through is not just a technological shift, it is a shift in the balance between the watcher and the watched. between those who hold power and those who live beneath its reach. Surveillance was sold as protection, data was sold as convenience, and visibility was sold as progress. But beneath those promises, something older has quietly taken shape again: control. Corruption has always depended on secrecy, but now it depends even more on predictability. It no longer needs to stay hidden if it can see everyone else clearly. It no longer needs to silence every voice if it can anticipate which voices might grow loud. And it no longer needs brute force if pressure can be applied invisibly, instantly, and without witnesses. Privacy stands in the middle of this struggle, not as a luxury, but as a barrier, a fragile one, a shrinking one, yet still one of the few things that prevents power from becoming total, absolute, and unchallengeable. Without privacy, there is no safe space for doubt, no shelter for dissent, no time for truth to gather strength before it is crushed. The tragedy is that most people will never notice when the last meaningful boundary disappears, because control does not arrive with sirens. It arrives with updates, with policies, with agree buttons, with quiet changes introduced during moments of fear. And by the time the cost becomes undeniable, the systems behind it are already too deep, too connected, and too powerful to confront easily. This is the price of a world where everything is visible, except the hands pulling the strings. In the end, the question is no longer whether privacy will disappear. The question is whether anything meaningful can survive once it does. Because when every movement is mapped, every word is logged, and every choice is predicted, power no longer needs to listen to the people. It only needs to manage them. And by the time that realization fully settles in, the pattern is no longer forming in the shadows, it is already complete. If this story changed the way you see the digital world, don't let the conversation end here. Share this with someone who still believes privacy is just a personal preference. Subscribe to Corruption Rewind for more investigations into money, power, and the systems that quietly shape our lives. And leave your thoughts below, because awareness only matters when it spreads.